This is Season 1, Episode 4. Let's just go ahead and dive right into the action. We open up in an alley where we see Rel Kwan and Beta watching Smoke fight 29 people by himself. Beta's like, "Yo, that's our homie. We gotta go help him." Kwan's like, "Yeah, I agree. But I don't think we can really do anything." Rel's like, "Yeah, they got him outnumbered and outgunned. There's not much we can do. Do you think if we sing and dance it would distract them?" Then we hear some gunshots off screen, and all three of them look towards the sound. Rel looks really concerned. He's like, "I feel like we should really try to sing this song and see if it works." Kwan says okay, and starts singing "Batty Boys Start With Pizza, Batty Boys Start With Pizza, Go Downtown. Find a roadside gal and go get her some pizza." Rel yelled that's not the song I was thinking out. Kwan puts his hand on his shoulder, and he's like, "No, that song always works, but they were gonna go after Smoke regardless." Rel looks down, and then he says, "Yeah, you're right. I promise I'm gonna get him back, though. I hope he lets me borrow $7 till tomorrow." Beta looks over at the pile of money that Smoke had dropped and said that would get me something from Five Guys. He's like, "Yo, I am starving. The last thing I ate was burnt bacon, man. That's worth leaving Smoke for." And Beta's like, "Nah, he's gone. We should go check on Shadow." As they turn around to leave, we see Smoke lying on the ground with blood coming out of his mouth. He spits it out, and it hits the ground. The blood evaporates and turns into smoke. Smoke raises his head, and he looks at the camera and says, "I am Smoke." Meanwhile, Rel's been walking through the city thinking to himself. He keeps looking behind him like he is worried that someone is walking in his trail of fart. He's like, what if my powers are growing too fast? What if I end up hurting somebody? Suddenly, Rel looks up into the sky. He sees a plane flying above the clouds, and he starts running towards it. Eventually, he's going so fast he's almost keeping up with the plane. He jumps up into the air and starts flying straight towards the clouds. We pan over to another part of town where we see a huge army marching through the streets. They're all wearing white sheets, and they have poop on the front of their sheets. They ray all armed with guns, and they ray headed straight for the spot where we last saw Smoke. At the front of the line, we see Kwan walking with confidence. Behind him, we see Beta walking with his head held high. While scratching his butt as they approach the area where Smoke was taken, we see Smoke standing on top of a building. He's talking to himself, and he says, "I'm not sure if I have Smoke powers or not. Maybe I just got lucky, and those guys didn't shoot me. Maybe I should test it out and see what I can do." As he's talking, he blows the largest cloud of smoke you ever seen. The smoke fills the air until everyone is unable to see and now are surprisingly hungry. It leaves behind a thick cloud, and once the cloud clears, we see that the entire city is at Basket Robbins. Smoke looks amazed, and he says, "Holy cow, that's crazy." Suddenly, Kwan runs up to him and says, "Yo, what's up? You all right?" Smoke looks down and sees Kwan, and he asks, "What are you doing here? Don't you guys have somewhere to be?" Kwan looks past Smoke and sees the army approaching. He tells Smoke to hide and says, "I'll explain later." Then he turns around and runs back to the army. Smoke slaps Kwan in the back of the head. Back with Rel, he's floating through the clouds, and he's enjoying the view. He takes a deep breath, and he's like, "Man, I wish I could stay up here forever." Suddenly, he feels a presence behind him, and he turns around to see a massive dragon. The dragon opens its mouth and lets out a loud roar. Rel gets scared and poops himself as he tries to fly away. But the dragon is way faster. It swoops down and tries to bite Rel. Rel moves out of the way at the last second and tells the Dragon to slow. Can't touch this. He starts glowing and he shoots a beam of light from his eyes. The light hits the dragon and it makes it vanish into thin air. Rel looks around and he sees more dragons flying towards him. He takes a deep breath and prepares to poop. Back with Quan, he's talking to the soldiers, telling them to hurry up and get inside position. Meanwhile, the soldiers start setting up their weapons and preparing to attack. Quan walks up to one of the soldiers and asks him what he's doing. The soldier points his weapon at Quan and says, "I'm setting up a force field generator. It'll keep Rel from entering." Suddenly, the generator sparks and explodes. The explosion creates a huge hole in the force field, and Rel appears in front of them. The soldiers point their weapons at Rel and tell him to surrender. Rel shakes his head and says, "Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna turn around and desert you." He starts glowing and shoots another beam of light. This time it hits the soldiers and knocks all of the heads off their shoulders. As Rel is fighting off the army, we see Smoke hiding in a Honda Civic with no doors. Rel looks over at Smoke to display his powers. He's watching as Rel takes on the entire army by himself. Smoke looks in awe and says, "I might have smoke powers, but I don't think I can do what Rel can do. Man, I wish I could be as strong as him." Suddenly, Quan runs up to him and says, "Yo, Smoke, don't be a bitch." Quan tells Smoke that they need to sing and dance a song that Rel created, and that Rel won't be able to hold off the army for much longer. Smoke hesitates, but then he says, "Okay, let's go." As they're running away, we see that Rel has finally defeated the army. He's standing in the middle of the battlefield surrounded by unconscious soldiers, with body parts scattered everywhere. He's confused, but he doesn't have time to think about it because suddenly he feels the ground shake beneath him. He looks up and sees that the dragon from earlier is back and it's breathing heavily. We pan over to a different part of town where we see Quan and Smoke hiding behind a dumpster. Quan is explaining his plan to Smoke. He says, "Listen, I know you have smoke powers, but I need you to try something for me." Smoke looks nervous, but he says, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" Quan tells Smoke to make a big cloud of smoke and then disappear into it. He focuses all of his energy, and suddenly the dumpster and the surrounding area is filled with smoke. Quan looks in and says, "Is that pizza in there?" Smoke replies, "Yeah, but you can't have none." Quan smiles and says, "All right, you wait till I get my own pizza," as they're running through the smoke. We see Rel fighting off the dragon. The dragon is too strong, and it knocks Rel's dreads to the ground. Rel picks up his dreadlocks and prepares to fight, but suddenly he feels a tap on his shoulder. He turns around and sees Quan and Smoke standing behind him. Quan tells Rel that they need to get out of there, that the dragon is too strong and there's no way they can win. Rel hesitates, but then he nods his head and disappears into the smoke with Quan and Smoke. The smoke clears and we see that the dragon is gone. We pan over to another part of town where we see Beta standing on top of a building. He's looking down at the city and he's thinking to himself, "That 5 guys from earlier really hit the spot." He's like, "Where is everyone? Why did they leave me here? I bet it's 'cause they couldn't have any of my food." Suddenly, he feels a presence behind him and he turns around to see Shadow standing on top of the building with him. Shadow looks down at the city and says, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Beta nods his head and says, "You think they got something to eat?" Shadow takes a deep breath and says, "Hey, wait, can you do that?" I can feel the pain, the anger, the sadness. It's so delicious. Beta screams and tries to punch Shadow, but Shadow disappears again and reappears on the other side of Beta. Beta looks at Shadow with a confused expression on his face. Shadow turns around and looks at Beta. He smiles and says, "You know what? I've had enough of this. I'm done playing nice." Beta gets scared and he waddles away. Shadow disappears and reappears in front of Beta. Beta turns around and Shadow punches him in the stomach. Beta doubles over in pain and Shadow continues to punch him. We pan over to another part of town where we see Rel, Quan, and Smoke walking through the streets. Smoke suddenly stops and says, "Wait, where's Beta?" Quan and Rel both look at each other and they shrug their shoulders. They don't know where Beta is. Rel says it's after 5 p.m. The three of them decide to split up and look for Beta separately as they're walking. We see Shadow with Beta trapped in a cage. Shadow is walking towards the nearest exit. Beta struggles to get out of the cage, but it's no use. Shadow disappears and reappears in front of the cage. He puts his hand on the bars and says, "I'm sorry, Beta, but it's time for you to die." Suddenly, one of the old men from earlier walks up to Shadow and says, "Why are you killing him, son?" Shadow turns around and looks at the old man. He says, "Because he's a monster. He's one of the bad guys." The old man shakes his head and says, "No, he's not. He's my friend." Shadow is confused, and the old man opens the cage, and Beta comes out. The old man walks up to Beta and starts rubbing on him. Beta screams like a girl, and the old man laughs. Shadow looks at the old man and says, "Who are you? What's going on here?" The old man ignores Shadow and walks away. Beta looks at Shadow and says, "What's happening? Why did he let me go?" Shadow looks at Beta and says, "I don't know, but I'm not gonna stick around to find out. This is weird. I hate you, Beta." Shadow disappears and reappears behind Beta. He slaps Beta in the back of the head repeatedly and says, "Goodbye." Suddenly, he hears some commotion coming from an alley. He walks in and sees that they're gathered around a gorilla. Smoke walks up to the gorilla and punches it. The gorilla rolled into a ball and cried due to the sheer power. Smoke tells the gorilla, "You are lucky I have somewhere to be on. I would turn you into a pair of house slippers." We pan over to another part of town where we see Quan and Rel walking through the streets. Quan suddenly stops and says, "Wait, I forgot something important. I have to go back and get it." Rel looks at Quan and says, "Sure, I'll wait here for you." Quan nods his head and disappears. Rel thinks to himself, what if I lose Quan in the portal? What if I never see him again? Suddenly, Quan reappears in front of Rel and hands him a box. Rel opens the box and it's filled with all of the weed he's ever wanted. Rel looks at Quan and says, "But how?" Quan smiles and says, "I have the strongest quantum powers." Rel shrugged. "That means my quantum powers are better than yours." One of my quantum powers is being super fast. Being super fast allows me to grab things from other dimensions and bring them to this dimension. Rel looks at the weed and says, "Wow, thanks, Quan." Quan nods his head and disappears. Rel thinks to himself, I hope Quan doesn't think him sharing. I mean, he's probably fine. But I just hope. Suddenly, Quan reappears in front of Rel and says, "Yo, we gotta go." El looks at Quan and says, "Okay." Then they both disappear into the portal. We pan over to another part of town where we see Shadow standing on top of a building. He looks down at the city and says, "It's time for me to take over." If you liked the video, please hit the like button below and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.